My name is Sean Bogle, and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for Kuali Research. And today we are joined by Marlise Blackburn from Indiana University and Hamza Asif, our Product Manager of Protocols and COI from Kuali Research. I'll go ahead and share a little bit about both of them. Starting with Marlise. Marlise Blackburn is the Director of Compliance Management Systems at Indiana University. Marlise joined Indiana University's Office of Research Compliance in 2011 and the Kuali community soon after. She has had the good fortune of never missing a Kuali day since 2013, the 8-year streak. Keep it up, Marlise. When not solving problems or collaborating with her wonderful colleagues, she enjoys spending time outdoors with family. And she thinks tacos or Thai food are perfect for any time of day. I can second that. And from Kuali, Hamza Asif from Kuali Research. Hamza Asif serves as the product manager for Kuali Protocols and COI. While fostering his background in building software products, Hamza focused across industries ranging from healthcare to education. When not geeking out on the latest trends in software development, Hamza spends his free time watching, playing, and discussing both basketball and MMA, mixed martial arts. Now I'll turn things over to Hamza.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, everyone, for joining. So I'm Hamza Asif, and for today's webinar, I think we'll focus on some key perceived benefits for schools and institutions of, I think, varying sizes by housing their research protocols under a single software application. And so throughout this webinar, I'll kind of share my screen at times, and I'll go ahead and demonstrate some also functionality when I screen share. And I'll kind of address these areas of collaboration among the varying protocol types, or at least we'll speak on some of the other things kind of in a more contextual manner, sharing some insights from Indiana University as it just went live with IRB protocols this past January. Before that, however, I am going to get a bit of a pulse check with this group on just to see kind of the current software solution for protocol management, if you have any at all. And I'll also set the table by jumping a little bit into some Kuali history, how we got to where we are today. From there, like I mentioned, Marlise and myself will cover sort of the meat and potatoes of our discussion, and then we'll open it up for some questions at the end with the group as well. So I'm going to go ahead and just take a quick poll here. And I'm going to read this out loud for our presenters who are joining, for both our presenters and our audience who are joining us. And that's just, what kind of solution are you currently using for protocols management? And the answer choices are A, manual, so paper, spreadsheet, PDF; B, an internally developed software; C, a third-party software; or D, none of the above or not applicable. And so we'll take just a couple seconds, get through this poll, and then I'll kind of share some of the results with the members here today. So I think the bulk of the group here might have had a chance to address the poll. And so just some breakdown of results. It looks like 33% of the group is going kind of paper, spreadsheet, or a PDF. A small portion of this group has some internally developed software as well, so a homegrown system potentially, about 13%. And then we've got a significant chunk of members who are joining us today who are using some sort of third-party software, right? So whether that's Kuali, any other piece of software on the market. And then we've got a small fraction of the group as well, so 7%, who are using none of this. So this is good. We've got a good sort of diverse result set here. The things that I'll touch on today will primarily focus on the unified system, right, through the lens of kind of Kuali protocols, but some, I think, benefits and perceived benefits are still applicable across the board for some of these other solutions. All right, so let's jump into a little bit of a history lesson. So who is Kuali? Who are we and kind of how we've gotten here? And at our core, you know, we're a software company, and we're very passionate about solving problems in higher education and research administration. Kuali aims to build software, I think, that improves the overall experience across institutions in higher education software and for the services that these institutions provide. And if I had to kind of confess, I think in many ways, the things we do at Kuali are not so much the core mission of the universities themselves, but rather they're all sort of these little other things that help fulfill that core mission. And so schools need to do research compliance, but that's not actually the research itself. And you have to submit grants, but that's also not the research itself, right? And this tends to be evident for us across our products across the board. This also tends to be something that schools have struggled with, I think, over the years. And you might have seen a decade or more ago for some members in this call that the only few options you had were sort of build your own software or purchase a piece of software that maybe was intended for businesses with higher education kind of slightly as an afterthought. And so dating back to 2004, there was essentially a coalition of several institutions in higher education who felt that they could maybe do better. And they felt they could build software collectively and avoid the dilemma of sort of, one brilliant engineer built this software. No one else understands it. How do we go about and manage it? And for a decade, I think that little coalition was largely pretty successful and more successful than the previous approach that had been kind of largely implemented. But after about a decade or so, right, what we kind of tend to see, I think, across the markets and across the industry was just that cloud hosting services, again, complicated. Schools didn't want kind of servers on premise. Being able to maintain the agility in developing and kind of shipping that software was also very important. And also kind of providing agile solutions, right, also became sort of a little bit of a pain point in building and developing that software. So in 2014, what happened was this group of folks decided to spin up a company, and we still kind of exist as this coalition of schools to fund, advise, and sit on the board where they founded the company. And so then since 2014, we've really expanded on that initial version and that initial idea of Kuali, and we've built out and expanded more of our product suite and sort of moved to the modern tool set. And we now kind of constantly look to iterate and improve on the software. I'm going to pause really quickly. I see there might be a question in the chat. If not, I will proceed.
I think we're good to go.
Okay, perfect. All right. So what's kind of central to our approach is that modern software component. And we still want to be able to provide some of that best software, right? A flexible solution without requiring teams at these institutions to have all the expertise locally to do that. We also want to deliver a great user experience. That's something that can be difficult for institutions to do strictly on their own, not always being able to sort of allocate the necessary teams or personnel to drive that kind of exclusive focus on iterating on research software. And as I've learned as a product manager, delivering a key, useful user experience that delights users is a lot harder than one might think. So firsthand lessons that I've kind of learned in the research space as well. And then we also want to be very community focused. And so we still have a lot of those early institutions who are involved in a part of the inception of Kuali to have a strong voice and collaborate. But then we'll having these new institutions that come on board to come in and have a say as well. And that's part of the reason, frankly, for some of the webinars like this is to be able to connect members of the research community as well. All right, and so just really quickly, we're going to break down the Kuali Research Suite. We've got kind of sponsored programs, so pre-award, post-award, and the various pieces that are involved in that. We have on the left side compliance, and under that kind of umbrella of compliance falls conflict of interest and conflict of commitment. And then we've got our 3 protocol types: IRB protocols, IACUC protocols, and IBC protocols under that unified system. And the benefit of that is sometimes we're able to build something and we have it for one protocol type, and that means we have it for all protocol types. We can build it for all the protocol types. Some of the newest pieces of this kind of diagram here are the export controls and the IBC protocols. But as we mentioned, today we'll look primarily at kind of these protocol types specifically and the perceived benefits of collaboration, data integrity, and maintaining compliance by having these protocols housed under a single system. Okay, so why a unified suite? The central theme of today's discussion. And I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, wow, Hamza, like this is so brilliant, because this was literally the first question on my mind. And that's perfect because we'll get to that. The first of these, I think, key perceived benefits is that centralized protocol management, right? So managing the protocol types, as we just mentioned, the IRB, IACUC, IBC under a single source. And one thing this does on its own is that it allows for key personnel, I think, to develop familiarity within the system, right? So particularly, I think this might be important with researchers where you have at different and varying levels with kind of overall degrees of involvement at different schools. I think there's familiarity that also varies with the researchers on the system. And so having one unified system that generally operates in a similar and same manner tends to kind of break down that learning curve, even for a user or a researcher who might be a very passive researcher and kind of come into the system to simply review a protocol and submit it, or a researcher who might have a more active role in a protocol, less of a passive user who's kind of involved in filling out data fields and sections of the forms themselves and then submitting that. And so on the Kuali side, we're kind of moving quickly to expand feature development for our customers in a way that works for each of these respective protocols. So like I mentioned, building one thing for one protocol type, having it across the board for these other protocols, while maintaining kind of some of the process sensitivity and nuances between these protocol types. And so, whereas in an IACUC review type, you might have kind of VVC as like an IACUC amendment, you might not see this across other protocol types. You might have designated member review across some protocol types and some not. And so there are nuances and a little bit of granularity that's factored into protocol types. But largely, you're able to have a system that mimics a lot of core functionality to help guide that kind of protocol lifecycle management. The next thing is increased collaboration. That's a critical aspect of the unified suite. And I think we're seeing more than ever, just geographically distributed teams kind of working across, whether it's state lines or countries and whatever have you, the kind of case varies, but we're seeing kind of more distributed teams that are involved in protocol management. There was, I believe, a Pew Research poll that had indicated maybe just over 61% of workers who are kind of working remotely, wanting that preference to continue working from home or home office remotely, wherever they may be. And so whether that's protocol preparers, the administrative staff, or whether that's ancillary reviewers who might work from a different location, I think a system that facilitates collaboration among varying roles and participants tends to mitigate errors on a protocol. It tends to speed up the time of approval on a protocol if you're facilitating that collaboration. And it well positions, I think, team members involved in handling the changes along the course of the research timeline to also be adaptive and responsive. So over the course of amendments and renewals, having kind of this collaboration fostered and sort of inherently a part of the system, this should reduce kind of any redundancy and time to completion within the overall protocol itself. The next bullet point is just consolidated information. And so consolidated information, I think, is also a benefit of the unified system, because as you look to maintain data integrity and structure for whether internal reporting, perhaps audits, having access to a structured set of data in one place provides that little bit of uniformity that can also facilitate compliance best practices. And whether that's kind of on the database side of Kuali, right, housing data in a similar manner, or providing that data to kind of schools to have their internally reporting needs be met, there's kind of a unique benefit, I would say, to having that consolidated information. And then the last thing is that you're also just able to maintain compliance, right? Facilitate those compliance best practices by ensuring some roles and permissions are applied across protocol types to kind of limit any inadvertent access, track user activity through kind of a robust and comprehensive activity log, and then just adhere to best practices in the case of Part 11 of the Code of Federal Regulations as well. All right, so it starts with the templates. And again, I think whether you're on a pen and paper protocol submission process, you're leveraging your own homegrown system, or you found a solution in the market, right? Research protocols at their core sort of go with a form field or fields of information that need to be filled out in order to guide it to approval. This kind of helps, playing with the template helps generally guide not only the researcher, but also the administrative staff to complete the protocol and take actions on a protocol in a manner that tends to adhere to best practices. So Kuali protocols is actually not much different from the general templates because that you might see in kind of your existing systems, because it serves largely as the skeleton of the protocol forms. And the form can be tailored to meet institutional needs, like I mentioned, and the scope of data capture as well. There's a fair bit of flexibility that's provided among the forms in Kuali protocols, and this kind of can capture a lot of submission data for the first time. So kind of anecdotally, with one of my customers, having some conversations as an IRB school and having an AHARP accreditation, tailoring the form and capturing information on the form in a way that marks kind of a submitted and complete submission once the protocol is submitted for administrative review is an important kind of regulatory practice or standard to meet with AHARP reporting. And so having these things, building these things into the system is very important. And we kind of look to facilitate that and aid that importance through not only the form itself, but mechanisms that are then built in to Kuali protocols itself. So I'm going to switch over for just a second, and I'm going to kind of share my screen on the protocol forms themselves. And so we have kind of here the bulk of what the protocol form might look like, and this might look overwhelming in the beginning, but we can break it down in a manner of ways. And so we have a form tailored towards, again, potential institutional needs, potentially in a manner that will guide researcher participation and submission that's most proper and most correct the first time around. And then we can kind of see here, I can add a variety of items as well. And so it kind of closed this tab out earlier, but I've got sections I can add, I've got groups I can add. There's various data elements, anywhere from a radio button to a checkbox to having various input areas, such as training, funding sources, these things, and also leveraging some integrations within the system and the forms themselves across protocol types to have some of this data appear at other parts of the protocol. We've also got some other things that integrate with different parts of the suite itself. So there's a disclosure status integration where schools who might be leveraging something like COI can see the disclosure information on the protocol form themselves. Being able to bring that pertinent and necessary information in the form is critical, but also tailoring the form in a manner like you might see here in our sample protocol. And if we view it in a manner that, again, guides completion the first time, ensures that we're capturing the right data the first time, and minimizes kind of any sendbacks or revisions along the way until its ultimate approval. And so by having kind of these multiple protocol types housed under a single system, this also tends to aid that process, but also what you end up having, I think, a lot of times is that these protocol types can then be configured by the generally what we call a system configurer, who will then develop the familiarity to produce and kind of edit the templates as they go along. So again, that kind of familiarity and seeing protocol types and the templates across different protocols helps kind of aid that familiarity within the system. Okay, so let's jump right back into my configuration. So again, I'm kind of back at my edit screen, and if I was here, I can kind of save my changes made, and I can even publish this as a new template. Of course, I'll have to sign in, which is always fun. And should I choose, I could go ahead, save and publish this template. But just at a rough glance, working through this protocol, kind of key sections here that were outlined in this kind of sample, very watered down IACUC protocol, where would be like a general information, a general questionnaire, a section for people, external training, some animals related sections such as species, testing attachments for those species. And then we've got kind of related drugs and substances, and then kind of procedures that might be tied as well. So sections, again, the length of a form, all this kind of stuff can be tailored by the institution to see how they best feel fit for the form in order to meet the research. Okay, and so we do have one question in the chat that I'll go ahead and address shortly, but hearing more about Part 11 compliance when the time's appropriate. So I can touch on that. I would say towards the end, I'm going to wrap up some things here, and we can touch on Part 11 compliance. All right, so I'm going to pivot back to our slides here, and we're going to go to roles and permissions. So ultimately, users drive the roles and permissions. Our user permissions drive that collaboration. And the collaboration kind of, again, being one of the key themes to touch on here in the webinar is that there's default permissions that can be provided to users. There's permissions that can be provided to users kind of intermittently throughout the protocol and at different times for administrative context. There's general permission settings that I'll also go ahead and show as well. And then there's sort of some default permissions for protocol access that I think we can run through as well. The last thing here is sort of external reviewers, right? And ancillary reviewers, also granting them access, configuring their ancillary review type, and then having them kind of have access through their separate screen is an example of roles and permissions. And so if I switch back over to my IACUC template, the first thing I do want to showcase is researcher roles and default permissions. And so default permissions could be that I've got some research personnel here. I'm going to add, let's say, a clinical research coordinator, if I can spell. add this user as a role, but also toggle their default permission. So we should say, hey, our CRC should have full access. And anytime our CRC logs into the protocol or is listed on a protocol, they will always have that full access. Should that change, which it can from protocol to protocol on a one-off basis, this default access will generally kind of populate. The next thing I do want to showcase is if I'm on a protocol form itself, which I might toggle to just here after I log in. So I've got an active IBC project, one that's been resubmitted. And let's say as it's resubmitted, the admin wants to take an action and send this protocol back to our researchers. So one thing I could do is I could go into the permissions in what's called like a permissions tab, and I can kind of add users intermittently to my protocol. And I can say, hey, we might need a new user on this protocol. So a generic name might be our friend Joe Tester, and we'll provide Joe Tester with full access for this protocol. So when this protocol is then again sent back to the researcher, Joe Tester will kind of be not so much a research contact, but an administrative contact who can help fill out and guide this protocol to kind of its resubmission and ultimately its approval. And so permissions again factors in, and all these permissions, what you might see, I'll kind of toggle through Joe Tester's access. Let's say we change it to read only, and then let's actually say we remove our person Joe Tester altogether. These would be documented in an activity log. And so kind of the last three lines here highlight, hey, Joe Tester was given access, Joe Tester's permissions were changed, and now they were removed as well. The other thing I think, which we already kind of have active here, is ancillary review. Ancillary review is a permission that can be tailored through a protocol ancillary review type that's created kind of in our general configurations. And if I was to add an ancillary review, in this case, as quick start, I can't, but I have one ongoing, the system will kind of add users and the right ancillary reviewers to the ancillary review type. So again, an example of permissions really facilitating protocol actions, right? So not necessarily in the case of the ancillary reviewer driving collaboration, more so in the case of the users at adhere driving collaboration in order to kind of complete protocol submission and guide it to approval. And so we'll find ourselves back on the protocol tab here. You'll see our general kind of protocol permissions were just these two personnel, so Damon Ralston and Jeff McGregor. And one thing you might see that we touched on initially was that our permissions, so Damon Ralston for this regular role as a PI, the default permission will kind of show here. So again, having the information also carry over across the protocol to provide the visibility, again, limits any confusion, any kind of redundancy errors that might generally occur. So one more time, we're going to go ahead and pivot back to our slides, and we're going to talk about notifications. And the power of, I think, customizable multiple notifications is hard to understate, and Marlise might feel differently in terms of how Marlise feels about notifications. But notifications can conceptually span across department types, depending on the users who need to be notified. An example of this might be within Kuali protocols, we have an action that's called notify to PI. And so on a protocol, you can have an action taken where as a protocol prepare. So I just give an example of Jay Tester, who might have been a protocol prepare. I can fill out the bulk of my protocol and I can notify the PI through a notification saying, hey, go ahead, log into Kuali protocols and submit this protocol, right? So again, one way to drive and facilitate that collaboration while putting some of the onus on the proper roles and the permissions that users have. There's also a reminder. So if on the first instance of this notification, my principal investigator misses, my initial notifications and they don't log into the system, having a reminder that might be triggered off interval dates to say, well, it tracks the action in a protocol, the protocol hasn't been submitted. So once again, a notification is fired out to the researcher, letting them know to log into Kuali protocols, review the protocol, and submit it. Another example might be revisions are required. And so I'll kind of go ahead and show this on the form itself. But in the case of revisions required, we can set an actual kind of due date. As an admin, if we have a protocol that's submitted for review, we can say, hey, this protocol needs some corrective actions. We can list those actions within sort of a commenting modal or a dialog box, and then we can associate a date when those revisions are due. So again, leveraging notifications to drive the action to somewhat facilitate that collaboration as well, to inform users actions are needed. And so once again, I'm going to log in because I'm getting really good at logging in. And we're going to go ahead and toggle down to our RIB configuration. And so one thing I had mentioned was a notify PI to submit, notify PI to submit reminder. Well, let's take our generic approval template within notifications. And we'll go ahead and expand this template. We'll make sure it's on. I can select certain roles that I would like within my recipients. So I can say on my approval template, you know what, I think all my protocol personnel should be informed. Or on an approval over protocol, I feel like, you know, also my assigned reviewers should be notified as well. The body and the text of the protocol, again, is kind of configurable to not necessarily drive the action, but aid the action. So the language here can be specific enough to inform the users on whatever the action might be. So maybe it's a case of approval, letting the PI know, hey, your protocol has been approved. Go ahead and start your research, whatever the necessary language is there to aid kind of that user actions. So users are still aware of any actions that they may need to take or they might not need to take in the case of an approval. A second thing I can do with a notification template is that I can turn on a second template and I can have one separate just for my PI, right? So in the case of an approval, I can take out or remove my PI from my initial notification, and I can create a separate notification template that'll send to just my PI in this case on an approval. And again, the language here is totally customizable, can be done and changed according to what an institution and admin feels is necessary. There's also a variety of kind of placeholder code. So we can say a review type, we can say the approval date, right? So the date that the protocol was approved on itself. All these things can go into the notification template, and that'll once again help kind of drive those actions, or in this case, maybe even a non-action. And so we're back at our notifying our users. And after this, what I'm going to do is I do want to touch briefly on the 21 CFR Part 11 stuff. So Kuali protocols being built in a manner to capture data, record data, ensure that users are authenticated in the system is kind of a key component in how the software is built and how the software is iterated on. So there may be kind of some areas where, as we don't capture signatures themselves, I think institutions have done something such as they'll include a little attestation section on the bottom of the form, indicating that, hey, as a PI, I'm kind of signing that I've reviewed the bulk of the protocol, and I'm going to go ahead and submit. When that PI submits, that action itself is logged. And so Kuali protocols is again built in a manner that is able to work through best practices that are stated in Part 11 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And so for our sake of time, I'm also going to pass it over to my co-presenter, Marlise Blackburn. We'll touch on any questions at the end if time permits. So Marlise, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hamza, and good afternoon or good morning to everyone, wherever you are. So some of you may have seen this cartoon on the left before. Get all the information you can, and we'll think of a use for it later. It illustrates an approach that was taken in the early life of electronic systems and can sometimes still prove to be a trap. Now in IT, we're dealing with massive processing power as well as stores of data, all with varying levels of importance. So the benefits of an enterprise or centralized system, if we go back to the basics of information management and think about at least 4 characteristics that are in all definitions of data quality, they are that the data are relevant, complete, timely, and accurate. And as Hamza just demonstrated, notifications, which are customizable, are a really great example of being able to take data and provide it in a timely and relevant manner to the users of the system. Whether it's actionable or informational, something that they don't need to take action on, there are ways to customize with that. So if we collect and curate data with those other 4 definitions in mind, we will also be able to unlock other value in our organizations. Next slide. A good place to start is understanding the purpose of your centralized system, or define why you need one. In a book published in 1988 entitled In the Age of the Smart Machine, The Future of Work and Power, the author Shoshana Zuboff envisioned 4 ways that information technology could be used in the workplace. They were to automate, informate up, informate down, or a vision to transform. And the automate was where IT would replace human activity. Informate up vision is where a leader uses automation and data collected to achieve greater control in the workplace. Informate down is where a leader uses automation and shares data widely to empower decisions at every level. And the transformative vision was where IT is used to completely change an organization. I would suggest that you might want to consider how do those visions apply to your systems and your electronic system needs. When we first implemented a researcher-facing IRB system in 2013, we were encumbered by many required fields in our off-the-shelf or out-of-the-box version of the system. Now, with Kuali protocols, the Human Research Protection Program has been able to create a form and a process that has meaning and capture data that they're able to review and act upon in ways that make sense for the compliance reviews as well as for researchers who are completing the form. So in the end, what this translates to is that research staff are spending less time on unnecessary questions or misunderstood fields, and that during compliance reviews, our compliance committees are able to focus on what matters and ultimately what benefits the research will be yielded to society and to the whole earth. So as Hamza emphasized in Kuali's vision as well, electronic systems should set people up for success during their first encounter. Next slide. For this event, I spent some time looking back on 8 years of electronic systems management at Indiana University. I thought about how many presentations I've either attended or presented in regarding lessons learned and best practices, and tried to think, what does that really mean? So it could be that we just like to hear other people's horror stories because it makes us feel better with the lessons learned. But also with best practices, it's because in the end, we need predictable outcomes, meaningful statuses, and we want to understand the triggers for processes or data that requires unique handling. As we all know, more information doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be better information. So I threw out a few lessons learned and best practices here. Again, you can find many of these in many places. And I'm always happy to have outside conversations about the meat and potatoes around each one of those. But I would like to highlight one of the best practices of designing with change in mind. Try not to design only around one way of doing something. Imagine what will your system and your data look like if it needs to be undone? Will it still be meaningful? Because as we know, regulations, leaders, processes change. And so you want to be prepared and equipped with the system decisions that you've made and your configuration in a way that you can adapt to those changes.
All right, thank you so much, Marlise.
Thanks. All right, and the next slide is, so where are we today? We're about 4 months into our IRB implementation. And in March, the Human Research Protection Program asked some questions of our researchers about their experience with the new system, alongside some other survey questions about their program and service. And as you can see, 66% of those personnel strongly agreed that Kuali protocols was easier to navigate and use than their prior system. And with this taking place just 2 months after go live, we saw that as a really positive reception during a pretty normally challenging or uncomfortable time for adapting to change for most users. Next slide. All right, and then this is a quote from one of those researchers again, which we just thought really highlighted the experiential part that we were looking forward to benefiting the university with. So some other benefits that we've realized with IRB implementation include integrations. The analysis we needed to conduct to make our integrations work have fostered communications, because just connecting data isn't enough. We still have to provide meaning to the other consumers of the data, like our grants and conflict of interest offices. This includes, just meetings and communication, but it can also include crosswalks and tools and business process discussions. So in addition, our IRB committees are really enjoying reviewing in the system. That is a benefit we were not able to offer them in the prior system, and so they're enjoying that. And the Human Research Protection Program staff have also been impacted in a positive way by no longer keeping paper copies of the protocols and eliminating an extra electronic copy that was being tracked in an additional storage location before Kuali protocols. This was really enabled because of the ease of navigation and integrity of the record. So those life cycle pieces that Hamza highlighted earlier in the demonstration. In addition, Human Research Protection Program leadership has reported increased productivity from staff. They've been able to meet promised turnaround times and goals that they've set with the research community. So this is allowing them to plan on devoting more professional staff time to other quality improvement programs, which will add value to IU's research portfolio and its compliance programs. And finally, my last slide. So we are now at a point of looking ahead. We're saying, what will multiple protocol types in one module mean for IU? We're looking forward to the increased expertise that we've gained through our tiered support. This means that whether it's an improvement, a bug, or a new feature, whatever it is, we're tracking it in one place. We can understand features fully, be prepared to leverage them differently based on the compliance area. In addition, we believe that having one platform will help with researcher familiarity across submission types. And we also are looking forward to realizing the benefits of the collaboration, such as ancillary review. This requires the workflow and processes to be shared, and also aids communication and rapidness of review. Some other things we're looking forward to in the future for Kuali's roadmap are full Encore integration and reporting and dashboards. I really feel strongly about this, especially because I think that that helps provide data to consumers at all levels of the university and really kind of acts out that informate down vision. Finally, IU has high standards of accessibility, usability, and data security and integrity. And being part of the Kuali community, where we can also take in everyone else's perspectives, we believe helps create the best features. So thank you for spending part of your day with us. And I think we'll move ahead to questions.
All right, thank you so much, Marlise. So yes, we're now in our questions phase, and I do see the question about getting copies of the slides. We will, just to reiterate, have a web link that provides a recorded version of this slide for everyone who's attended, so we can certainly provide that. And moving on to a couple of other questions that we have here. So one question is, how long would it take to implement the protocol solution at a new university?
Sure. I guess Marlise and I can both probably touch on this. Timelines vary. So sometimes they vary whether or not a school chooses to implement with some of our quality implementation team, or kind of implement on their own and go through the process kind of individually. Some of it depends on, I would say, kind of overall volume of research itself. I think the other kind of factors that might influence implementation timelines are the types and numbers of modules that are also being implemented, right? So kind of maybe not just IRB on its own initially, but implementing with IRB, IACUC, and IBC all kind of consecutively. So these implementation timelines can vary as well. Marlise is probably a better resource than I am here, as kind of Indiana University did go live in January. So Marlise, if you have anything to add, feel free.
I mean, I think your inclusion of it depends on some of those other factors is true. I think some of the biggest time intensive activities of implementation can be migration and integrations. So just depending on what your needs are there, and often if you're coming from a paper system and going into an electronic system, I could probably be even faster than moving from one electronic platform to another.
All right, thank you, Marlise. And that's a pretty good segue for our next question, which is a general question about the cost of implementation.
Sure. So implementation services also vary kind of on those service agreements and the length of the implementation timelines itself. And then overall kind of cost of the system, while I'll kind of give Kuali a nudge and say they're affordably priced. That also varies, I think, based on the overall protocol volume. And so that's kind of how the cost weighs into both of those areas. So it's hard to provide specifics. And unfortunately, if I wanted to, I don't remember a tiered number for each step of the way.
Sure. All right. Thank you, Hamza. Our next question, if you all could provide a little bit more feedback on the IRB committee members and how they interact with the system.
Sure, I think that's for IU's particular use of it right now. So they are still sent communication outside of the system from someone who handles the committee process, but they're provided direct links to the protocol and to the particular submission that they're assigned. And they were previously in our prior system, they were provided PDF copies of everything in a SharePoint site and filled out, separate checklists. So they're really enjoying being in the system and seeing the information directly. I hope that helps. And I'm definitely happy to arrange, an IU specific demo for someone if that would be of interest in the future.
Thank you, Marlise. Our next question, it pertains to barriers. What kinds of barriers do institutions have to overcome in order to achieve integration?
Sure, that's a good question. So integration, some we do have built in, and some are kind of cross-module integrations in Kuali protocols, kind of pulling information from sponsored programs and from COI. The other kind of way is we leverage APIs, I think, to a large degree in order to meet kind of outside integrations that schools need. And so being able to kind of leverage some of those APIs is a good way to pull data for something we might not generally support or have in kind of off the bat integration with. But that being said, kind of the integration library itself is growing, and kind of we look to expand on our integrations as well.
Thank you, Hamza. Our next question, what kind of integrations have institutions found to be most helpful? I'm thinking about city training and sponsored programs, things of that sort. So yeah, what kind of integrations have been the most helpful for institutions?
Sure, for sure. I think city training is a big one, right? And this is something I'm also seeing across as I kind of develop and build out the IBC module, is city training is becoming a huge thing as well. Integrations across kind of funding sources is also a very big one, right? These kind of other integrations. Marlise, if you've seen any other integrations that have kind of been valuable to IU, I'm sure that would benefit some of the folks. Okay.
All right. So we'll go to the next question, and perhaps both of you could speak to this. But how does Kuali handle the protocol continuing reviews for relying sites?
Sure. So continuing review is still built on. So while relying sites kind of are a tab that's accessible in the protocol, continuing review itself is started on the protocol, and the information has to kind of be transferred to the relying sites, right? So relying sites need to be made aware of the continuing review on the protocol itself. So it's a process that I candidly think could use a little bit more facilitation, involvement, and probably a little bit more love as well. But it's an ongoing kind of developing process there as well. So as long as kind of the site is aware of the continuing review, which can be done sometimes internally, sometimes externally throughout the system based on notifications, this is one way that kind of helps guide that collaboration from that effort from those sites.
All right, I'm seeing one more question that just came in, and it's talking about or identifying what the best way is to stay up to date on the rules and regulations that their school needs to know to stay compliant with various protocols.
Sure. Marlise, I will punt that to you if you'd like to take this one. Best ways to stay up to date. That's a good question. As a non-subject matter expert, rather, I am aware of regulations kind of as they evolve and develop, maybe slightly a little bit before, and kind of what I'm keeping up with. But in my particular case, once kind of the team is aware of regulation through whatever kind of avenue that might be, current events, news, trainings that we might take, that's how we then build the system out in a way, or develop and plan feature enhancements or iterations to pertain to locking down to those best practices and regulations. So it's a little bit of a non-answer there, but it's hard to kind of stay proactive in the loop with regulations, I think, unless you have kind of membership in industry kind of groups and things of that nature.
Yeah, I would echo that with the different professional organizations that exist, and a couple of the accrediting bodies, whether ALAC for animal research or AHARP for IRB, and Primer, public responsibility in medicine and research. There's a lot of, I think, regional listservs and things too, but without knowing more about maybe which set of regulations that questioner was asking, I don't know what other examples to provide.
Sure. And Sean, just before you move on to the next question, there was also, I think, a question I saw somewhere on best practices, right? So something, I'm not seeing it in the chat, but templates being configurable, right? And if schools kind of want to configure it to their own way, how do we kind of still enforce that best practice, right? So there is, like kind of we saw in that little GIF on the slide, was that, you know, there's so many possibilities with templates. And so how do you actually enforce those best practices? Part of the way is kind of our recommendations that our team can make, right? We kind of use the subject matter expertise of our kind of customer success staff to help influence and tailor the way templates are built out. Otherwise, there are kind of small nuances and restrictions that might be limited in template creation as well. So largely, you could create a form that might have checkboxes and radio buttons all over the place through a number of different sections. But that won't necessarily take away from the research compliance and kind of maintaining compliance itself, right? So long as the data capture is enforced in a way that kind of adheres to compliance regulations, and so long as the flow of the protocol itself throughout its stage, multiple stages, is adhering to compliance best practices, the template itself won't factor in, I would say, too much, but there is kind of small built-in restrictions that you'll encounter within a template.
All right, thank you. Another question that's came up is text transfer involved, for example, with COI or SBIR, STTR?
So text transfer, not with COI to my knowledge, but I believe within sponsored programs, tech transfer is becoming a growing kind of topic that the team has discussed. So I can't fully touch on that. But if there is information that then flows from sponsored programs to protocols, the necessary information can be pulled in. But to my knowledge, not with COI and having tech transfer.
Okay. So at this time, it looks like we have answered all the questions that have been submitted. I want to, again, thank both of our presenters here today and thank you all for the great questions.